Today, we have three presenters with us. Dr. Yani Zhang is a professor and associate chair of the Department of Organizational Performance and Workplace Learning in the College of Engineering at Boise State University. She teaches graduate courses on program evaluation, survey design and data analysis, and quantitative research in organizations. She runs a workplace-oriented research central lab where teams of practitioners and researchers conduct research on various topics in the workplace learning and performance improvement context. She often provides pro bono consulting to organizations to help them develop quality survey instruments and facilitate data-driven practices. Next, we have Jennifer Shamsy. She is an airline pilot by day and performance improvement specialist, online educator, researcher, and writer by night. Over the last 14 years, she has combined her love of aviation and passion for instructional design and online education through course design, development, implementation, evaluation, and instruction of future aviation professionals at several higher education institutions. She is currently an adjunct faculty member for the Organizational Performance and Workplace Learning Department at Boise State University, teaching a course on survey design and data analysis. Lastly, we have Douglas Hutchinson, who is a graduate assistant for the Department of Organizational Performance and Workplace Learning in the College of Engineering at Boise State University. He joined Dr. Chang's Workplace-Oriented Research Central team in August of 2019. He is currently studying to earn a Master's of Science degree in Organizational Performance and Workplace Learning. He expects to complete his degree in May of 2021. We are grateful to have them presenting with us today. Thank you all for your time, and you may begin.
All right. All right. Thank you, Christine. So yes, thank you everyone for coming to this webinar. We are from Boise State University, and we are in Boise, Idaho, and the background that I'm using today is the Boise campus, Boise State University campus. My name is Yani Zhang, and I'm a professor in the Department of Organizational Performance and Workplace Learning at Boise State, and I am with two colleagues, as Christine introduced here. So Jennifer Shamsy is one of the adjunct faculty member in our department, and she, because we are totally online, she's teaching from Atlanta, Georgia, and Douglas Hutchinson, and he is a graduate assistant in our department. So our presentation is about survey design. So in your survey questionnaire, you can have open-ended questions as well as closed-ended questions. Our presentation today is about how to design closed-ended survey items that contain a set of questions and response scales. That is the basic anatomy of closed-ended survey items, right? So there we go. Another thing that I would like to point out to you up front is that we need to differentiate survey items that are designed to capture factual information and survey items that measure how people perceive the quality or value of something. So there are two types of survey items that we usually design. And so let me ask you a quick question. You see two closed-ended survey items on your screen. So which one is designed to capture factual information and which one is to measure people's perceived value of something? So it's a very quick, simple question. So if you would like to just open up your chat box and then write A or B in there, just quickly to check out our understanding. A or B, which one is capturing facts and which one is measuring perceived. Yep, A fact, A is factual, B is perceived. Yes, yes. Both measure someone's perception. Yes, can be. All right. So yes, my intention was that A is capturing the factual information and B is measuring the perception. Now somebody says it could be capturing both capturing perception. It can be if you say that how many times have you used this device, this kind of perceived things, but actually to that person is the fact that, yeah, I used only 1 or 2 times. But the B is like how useful was it for you, then that is their own perceived value or quality of something. So keeping that in mind, let me go to the next slide. Think about some of the survey questionnaires that you recently designed or completed. And I won't be surprised if you tell me that some of the survey items collected factual information and some of them collected it the other way, perception. So factual information such as age, ethnic background, years of experience in the job position, or items like what you see on the screen right there. Another example is the census surveys, and then they collect factual information. And I'm sure other types of surveys that you fill out measure how good something was, how you perceive the quality of value or something, like a workshop or a course that you delivered or you received, completed, or cultural, organizational culture, your level of engagement, job satisfaction, etc. So our presentation today is going to be to focus on this type of closed-ended survey items that are intended to measure perceived quality or value of something, okay? There are lots of things that go into survey design, but my colleague and I have written some series of articles talking about those important evidence-based survey design principles. And our presentation today is based on some of the articles that have been published in ISPI Performance Improvement Journal and the new one that is in review right now. And we will include a link to each article in the checkbox at the end of our presentation. But in these articles, we talk about survey design principles such as would you include midpoint or not? Strongly agree on the left side or right side, and does it matter? Or use a radio button, slider, things like that. So we also actually made a presentation for the ISPI BEPS chapter a couple of years ago. And that was more about including or excluding midpoint and whether to include negative border survey items or not. So please feel free to review that recorded session a couple of years ago. And for our today's presentation, we have 3 main topics. We will provide you with an overview of various response scales and some survey design issues that you have to keep in mind when designing evaluation or needs assessment type of survey. And then we'll explain ceiling effects and what you can do when you want to reduce ceiling effects in your survey design or data. So next, I'll hand you over to Jennifer, and then she will talk about various response scale. Now I'm going to give her remote control. There we go, Jennifer.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Yanni. So the first topic today is choosing appropriate response scales. And in your open-ended questions, you don't need to choose a response scale. Your survey participant's going to do all the work for you by providing a response. But with a closed-ended response scale, the survey respondent must choose from a predetermined set of responses that you, the survey designer, are going to provide. All right, so there's many different types of response scales. Some will be used to measure facts, like Yanni mentioned, such as male or female, yes or no. And then some response scales will be rating scales, where you're measuring the quality or the value of something. Now, there's several different types of scales, including discrete rating scales, continuous rating scales, numerical rating scales, verbal descriptor scales, and web-based sliders. Discrete rating scales, like our 5-point Likert that we have here, is where you have 5 discrete points from the respondent to pick from, and only those points, such as strongly disagree, disagree, agree, etc. Then you have continuous rating scales. A continuous rating scale might use a slider scale or some other type of method to provide the respondent with many more choices. They can pick anywhere along the continuum, and depending on the fidelity of the interface, it can measure a much more sensitive range of responses, maybe up to 100 points or so, depending on where the respondent places their response. Then we have numerical rating scales, and those are discrete rating scales where there's numbers as response options for the respondent to pick from, and verbal descriptor scales that include labels. Then we have web-based sliders. You may see sliders from time to time, especially in your web-based surveys. Now, these have kind of a cool technological component to them, but they may not always work so well when you have interfaces such as mobile devices. Now, sliders can either be continuous or discrete scales, depending on how the software is set up. If a respondent places the slider at a position and that exact point is the data recorded, then you have a continuous rating scale. But if they place that pointer at a spot and the software rounds up or down, often called a snap to function, then you have a discrete rating scale. Now, there's a lot of research out there about all of these response scales and lots of different benefits and challenges to each. And though we'd love to talk about all of them, we just don't have the time today. So I do encourage you to reference those articles that Yanni mentioned earlier, and we're going to provide the links after the webinar is finished so that you can reference those. But most of our discussion today is going to talk about the verbal descriptor scales. Those are the ones that you're most commonly going to see in organizational or performance improvement surveys. So let's get started. Here's some examples of some survey questions, some statements or questions paired with a verbal response scale. These questions and statements want to investigate the type of relationship that an employee has with his or her supervisor. Now, you can investigate this in a couple of ways. You can use statements such as, I have a good relationship with my supervisor, or you can use some questions like, do you have a good relationship with your supervisor, or what kind of relationship do you have with your supervisor? So that brings up an interesting question that I want to pose to you, and you can just write in the chat box real quickly. Which do you think would be better to use in a survey? Would it be questions or statements? Which have you used, or do you see used, or that you would think would be the best? So what does everybody think? Okay, so a mixture of both. Statements. Looks like some statements. You see those quite often. Nobody likes questions, huh? Questions, okay. Yeah, you'll see a combination of a little bit everything out there, lots of different surveys out and about. So let's kind of delve into that topic a little bit more. Which is better? Should we be using questions? Should we be using statements? It's an important design decision that you'll make. So depending on what you decide, it's going to affect the response scale that you'll need to choose. So here's two surveys. We have a collection of statements on our left, and then we have a survey that has a collection of questions on our right. They're both asking for the same types of information. They're just doing it in different forms. So we're going to take the first from each as an example. We have our statement, I have a good relationship with my supervisor. And then we have our question, do you have a good relationship with your supervisor? They're measuring the same thing, the relationship between the supervisor and the employee. Now, most likely these statements and questions are part of a survey that's measuring something bigger. It's looking at a bigger construct like employee satisfaction or maybe even organizational culture. But these two survey items differ on how they use response scales to measure that relationship. The statement's response scale measures in terms of agreement, while the question's response scale looks in degrees of the relationship. So again, we're back to that question, which one should you use? Well, to help you make that decision, there's some important factors that you should keep in mind. One's concerning data. What type of data do you want? How do you want to use that data? And how will you present that data? Now, one of the most important takeaways that we want you to have about survey design today is thinking backwards. Make sure to have a clear vision of what you need to obtain from your survey. What's your end goal? What's your desired outcome? Before you even sit down to start constructing your survey items and then choosing the response scales. Having this clarity will make these decisions so much easier and much more effective. Now, part of thinking about the data is how will you use it. This includes any type of statistical analysis that you think you're going to want to do. And don't worry, we're not going to talk about statistics today. That is definitely a topic for another webinar, but just very simply. In our statements example, all of our statements are paired with a 5-point Likert response scale. A strongly disagree response on statement 1 would be just like a strongly disagree on statement 2 or statement 3. We're comparing apples to apples. In this case, you could take the data and combine it or compare it from all of these survey items and create an average score, as well as do other statistical analysis. If this is your desire, then statements are often easier to use and to pair with consistent response scales. Now, when using questions in your surveys, you may have to create more individually tailored response scales to fit with the question. These may help capture different types of data, like our response scale in question 1, where we have poor, sometimes good, sometimes bad, good, or excellent. Or what about question number 3, where we have unfairly, somewhat fairly, pretty fairly, and highly fairly. Now that you're using different response scales, you're not comparing apples to apples. For instance, a poor response in question number 1 is not the same as an unfairly response in question number 3. In this case, you would be limited in combining or comparing the data from these survey items together. And with the different response scales, you're also limited in your statistical analysis. Now, regardless of which you choose, remember that you can't change the data once you collect it. So again, you want to have that clarity. You want to make sure that you have a clear idea of what you need before you start constructing your survey so that you don't have any regrets. Now, another part of the data factor is how you're going to present it. Again, thinking backwards. With either of these scales, you could take the data and identify frequency of responses, such as 22 respondents agree that they have a good employee-supervisor relationship, or 1 strongly agrees, or 3 strongly disagree. You can also show it in terms of percentage. 75% of respondents pretty much think they have a good relationship with their supervisor. So you want to think about how you want to present the information. Do you want to do it in terms of degrees of something or levels of agreement? Again, envisioning how you want to present the results will help you pick those response scales, and then you'll be able to best determine if you need to pair them with a statement or a question. Now, another factor that you want to take into consideration is your respondent. How will he or she read and respond to the response scale that you give them? You'll want to pair a response scale with your statement or your question so that it provides a large enough range of responses that it's adequate for them to pick from. Now, Douglas is going to talk a little bit more about this when he talks about ceiling effects later in our presentation. But you do want to make sure that you use a response scale that makes sense to your respondent. Think about adopting a conversational tone with your survey participants. So to show you what I mean, here's a quick example. We have our question, do you have a good relationship with your supervisor? And it's paired with a response scale that has responses of excellent, good, sometimes bad, and poor. The responses don't really fit this question very well. They don't totally make complete sense, and so they can create some confusion and be cognitively taxing and fatiguing for your respondents. But if you change the question around a little bit to what kind of relationship do you have with your supervisor, and then you give them those choices of excellent, good, etc., now it makes sense. Now, another respondent factor that comes into play when using the same type of response scales in your survey is that respondents may tend to see everything kind of as the same bunch of words on a page or a screen, and they become careless in their responses without fully giving thought to each of them. Everything just kind of blurs together, and this can affect the validity or reliability of the results that you're getting from your survey. So by using different types of response scales, kind of a mixture of them, you might be able to minimize this carelessness by drawing the attention to your survey items. You could also use a pilot test that could help kind of flesh out some of these respondent related details. Now, there's no one-size-fits-all right or wrong answer in the survey design process. You should be making design decisions in the context of your performance improvement initiative. However, we've touched on some things that you should keep in mind to make the process more effective, and so I just want to quickly recap some of those takeaways for you. The first option that you have when you're doing your survey design is to use survey statements in the same response scale. Using these same response scales allows us to compare and combine data from the items and more fully analyze a dimension by calculating an average score. This also allows a lot more freedom in terms of statistical analysis. But there's drawbacks, and so one of the drawbacks of this approach might be that you don't obtain the data that fits into what you desire to use it for or your presentation plan. And also sometimes respondents could become careless in their responses with using the same like response scales. Another option that you have is to use questions, and again, a consistent response scale. The benefits and the drawbacks are generally the same with this approach. And with this option, you might also need to kind of reword your questions slightly to make sure that they pair correctly with the response scale and that they do make sense. Now, when you're using the same response scale in your survey, it opens up a lot of different options for you. The final choice that you have is to use different response scales. You may choose this because of the potential for respondent carelessness, or because maybe you want to use the data in a different way or present it in different types of data. However, you have to be careful when you use this type of design, and it should be carefully balanced with the other factors. There will be limitations when you try to compare or combine the data from several different items together because you are using unlike scales. And this also limits you a bit in your statistical analysis and might change the type of presentation that you can make with that data. So now, regardless of which decision you make, whether you use statements or you use questions, same response scales or different response scales, crafting surveys is always a balancing act. So we've covered lots of ground today on using some survey statements and questions, and then the types of response scales that you want to pair with them. Yanni's going to expand a bit more on using these different types of survey items in an evaluation or a needs assessment. So I'm going to give you the remote control back, Yanni. Thank you so much.
So thanks, Jennifer. So yes, let's talk about a few methods we can use when conducting surveys for evaluation and needs assessment. We all know about the basic ADDIE model: analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation, right? So we as training and performance improvement practitioners often use surveys to gather some information in each of these ADDIE steps. So what if you are trying to develop a survey questionnaire to be used in your evaluation project now? So one strategy you can use is to find out if some sort of a theoretical framework was applied to the design of a program that you are about to evaluate, and then apply the same theoretical framework to your survey design. That's one strategy. So for example, I'm going to just use one of the models, like ARCS model. Are you familiar with the ARCS model? I'm sure you are. ARCS, A is attention, R relevance, confidence, and satisfaction. So if you design your instruction, let's say you're about to evaluate a training program, and then training program was designed with the ARCS model in mind because in the past there was some sort of a motivational issue, so that you want to improve the motivational appeal of the training content now. So training was developed and delivered, now you're about to evaluate it. So now you're applying the same ARCS model to your survey design to measure the attention, relevance, confidence, and satisfaction factors within the training content. So that's one way you can do that. Now, you can develop your own survey items about these 4 factors, but actually there is an instrument called the Instructional Materials Motivation Survey built by the developer of the ARCS model, John Keller out there. So I'm showing you some of the survey items on the screen. There are a total of 36 items in that questionnaire using a 5-point scale from not true to very true. And so you can, if you find this sample or the actual instrument out there, then you can adopt some of the existing survey items if they are useful for you. And sometimes the problem is that the wording used in the existing questionnaires may not apply to your job situation, or wording does not really work for your survey participants. Then you might need to modify a little bit, or you might have to come up with your own survey items. There is a whole lot to do after you develop your own, because you have to test the validity and reliability, all that, but that's another topic too. So benefit of using existing instrument that has been validated is because it has been validated, and reliability and all that has been shown. All right, so using a theoretical framework is a good way to develop survey items, but for evaluation, we usually think about conducting a survey at the end of a program. right? But you also know that we need to collect some data prior to the program. So we need to have a pre-survey and perhaps a follow-up post-survey as well. So without pre-survey, we don't know if the post-survey scores indicate an improvement because of the intervention, or the participants already had that kind of condition or confidence level or motivation level or not. We don't know that without pre-survey data. And without follow-up post-survey data, we don't know if the change will be sustained for a long time or not. So having both a pre-survey as well as a follow-up survey in addition to the post-survey will be a lot of valuable data for you. And doing this type of repeated measures is very helpful because each survey data will help us come up with a different set of strategies to use. I mean, based on the pre-survey, we can do something about the conditions of the training program, and follow survey also brings up some feedback to, okay, go back and do some changes so that it will sustain, the information will sustain for a longer time. So when we want to use pre and post surveys or pre-post surveys, the key here is comparison. That's very important. We want to design the set of survey questionnaires so that we can compare the data over time, right? So what it means is that the pre-survey and post-survey questionnaires should use same or very similar survey items so that we can compare over time. And that means we have to include the same response scale as well. Not only the survey item that statements or questions, but survey response scales should be the same so that we can compare apples and apples. So I do some pro bono consulting to help out nonprofit organizations to do their program evaluations. And in one of the program evaluations that I did a couple of years ago, and the organizations did really good job using all three surveys, pre, post, and 6 months follow-up survey. Excellent, right? But what they did was that they did not use exactly same survey items in all three surveys. So what I was able to do for them was to compare the pre-survey and the 6 months follow-up survey, because those two were similar in terms of design, but I couldn't compare the post-survey with the two other survey data because the post-survey they used was very different. So what you can see on the screen is not from that example that I'm just talking about, but I'm just showing you that if you use the same survey items on your pre-survey and post-survey, you can compare before and after and tell the difference. Now, the question here is, what if you did not have a chance to conduct a pre-survey? Sometimes you weren't involved in any of those kind of plans prior to the program, or you did not plan to do it, or participants cannot be reached out before the program started. So you just don't have pre-survey data. What do you do? In that case, you can still, if you still want to or need to have that precondition, that you can use the method called retrospective pre and post survey method. So are you all familiar with that? Retrospective pre and post survey method? Would you just write yes or no in the checkbox to let us know? Yes, a couple of yes there. No, yeah, you're now, yes. So basically what you're doing is on your post-survey, so you don't have pre-survey data right now, you cannot go back and do that. So on your post-survey, you're asking the participants to think about what it was like before they completed the program compared to what is now that you have completed the program. This method can be quite useful because it naturally asks them to reflect on the level of improvement before and after. And sometimes you do pre-test like a month ago and then post-test now. And sometimes you feel like, oh, I know so much more. I didn't know that I didn't know what I didn't know before. So their pre-survey data wasn't as accurate. You know, sometimes you feel like that. So I rated it high in the pre-survey, but now at the end, the post-survey, I feel like, oh, I didn't know about any of that. So, you know, but in this, using retrospective pre and post survey, you are able to compare your before and after condition right there. So far, I pointed out that you want to use the same or similar survey items when you compare pre and post survey data, right? The same technique, principle applies when you use 360-degree surveys for triangulation purposes. So, for example, if you conduct a survey with employees and with their supervisors and with their customers, you do want to use very similar, if not the same, exactly same survey items and response scales. So what, as you can see on the screen, very similar items, but slightly different wording added to each questionnaire so that you can compare all three different types of data. So what you want to do is to think about what needs to be measured first and then change the wording slightly for each questionnaire. All right, so now that was for quickly about evaluation type of survey, but now we use a survey for needs assessment projects too, right? Quite often. So again, think about a couple of useful theoretical frameworks that you can use to develop your needs assessment survey items. One particular model that comes to mind is Thomas Gilbert's behavior engineering model. And you probably have other models that you have in mind, like a Rumler and Brash's different 9-box model or other things like that. So it depends on what you're doing for your needs assessment and apply the theoretical model to your survey design. So this BEM, behavior engineering model, is really helpful because it helps you go through these 6 different factors to see what's going on in the environment and the performance status. And the environment factor includes data, resources, and incentives. And each category helps you come up with specific survey items that you want to ask about. For example, the data. For data, you in your survey questionnaire, you might want to ask if the expectations were clearly set or not, or if the feedback was given properly or frequently. So those categories kind of gives you the ideas, oh, I want to ask about these types of things. And again, personal factors include knowledge, capacity, and motives. And again, each of these 3 categories helps you come up with survey items to be used. So like for the knowledge category, you want to ask if workers have task-specific skills or not. And if not, if training will be good or job aid will be good. So you can ask those kind of specific questions in your survey. It's not too different when you come up with the survey items for needs assessment. It's not too different than the evaluation approach, but the focus here is more on finding out the needs or gaps in performance and finding ways to close the gaps. Whereas the evaluation type of survey is to combine some information together and then say, hey, what's going on here? What happened? So afterwards. So for that reason, the way you design your survey items for needs assessment can be a little bit different than the way you do or design the survey items for evaluation projects. So you see A and B on the screen. Compare how A and B are designed. On A, if you're conducting an evaluation, and especially a summary evaluation where you have to make a judgment about the quality of the program, like how good it was that, whatever that is. And then your survey might look something like A there, because you want to, construct is another term, but what it means is that when you evaluate something, that something is a construct. And then when you evaluate a construct, especially it's a very complex construct, then you need multiple survey items to measure that construct. You have to ask a bunch of questions to measure the complex aspects about that thing. So naturally, you do want to have the same response scale so that you can, if you have like 10 questions or 15 questions about that construct, then you want to calculate the average score of that data and then see, oh yeah, that was this good or this bad. So that's for more evaluation, especially summary evaluation type of survey design. But the B type on the right side is, they're also good, nothing wrong about that, no problem. The response skills are more specific, right? Now, when you get the numerical data, like a 4 on the left side, you kind of have to interpret what 4 would mean. But the benefit of using the B type of survey item is that you don't have to guess that. So most of the time, it's it. That's the meaning right there. So you don't have to guess what the number 4 meant when respondents selected 4. When respondents selected most of the time, yes, they meant that, right? So B type of survey items could be good for summative evaluation or needs assessment when you need to come up with appropriate strategies for different level of responses. Like if it was most of the time or rarely or never, then you know exactly what you need to do to manage that kind of condition or situation. But there are a couple of things that you should pay attention to, though, when you use more specific response scales, like a B type or even longer response scales, because the more detailed response scales are, the more detailed the response scales are, the lengthier your overall survey questionnaire will become, right? We all know about this survey fatigue. We don't want to give them like a 3-5 page long survey items right there. So as you can see, A on the left side shows 4 questions already, but B on the right side can only show 2 questions on the same space, same length. So you have to keep in mind about that. Second one is when you use tailored response scales for individual survey items, you may or may not be able to combine the data. Like Jennifer already talked a little bit about that. So if you need to combine data to make some average score to show the quality or value of that particular construct, then you have to keep in mind, okay, how do I design my survey? What kind of response scales do I need to use to be able to do that? So that's that. Now, I'm showing you another one. So let's compare A, B, and C. So C gets a little even longer, right? Would you, if you are a respondent and receive the survey items that are like a C type, a lot of C type of questions, how would you feel about that? I mean, let's say there are 15 or 20 items filling out these items. Would you be fine with that? Or would you feel like, oh, wow, that's a long survey. I don't want to, fill out. I don't have time. Or have you seen this kind of survey item? Would you, somebody says C would kill me if my organization gave me pages of this. Yes. Well, that's a concern. Yes. Thanks, Jason. Now, so we really have to think about cognitive overload when we design surveys as well. The survey fatigue is there. It's no joke. I mean, we really have to think about it. Personally, I will be very cautious about using C type of survey items because although it provides more detailed information on the response scale, but I'm more concerned about whether I will get the data even, because some people may not choose to fill out the survey. So
Yanni,
yes,
we had one comment about that. Maybe you can address it now instead of the Q&A, that the C option, the expanded response scale, is more actionable than a bunch of numbers.
Right. That's another consideration. Yes, it's a balancing act, just like Jennifer, you talk about balancing act. Sometimes C type of question may be useful. Let's say you have only 5 questions. There's only C type. And then you just need to focus on those specific ones. Then you might be okay. Now think about B type though. B type can give you the very same information and you don't have to spell out all the things in sentences. That's what I'm saying. I mean, B type is as good as C if you're trying to reduce the cognitive overload. So that's something you have to consider. So so when we talk about this survey fatigue, and so what if somebody said, hey, then what if we just reduce the number of options so that there is less text to read? So on the right side is longer, and then on the left side is longer, and then right side is shorter because I got rid of 2 options there. So would that be a better strategy then? But well, it could, but there's another thing that we have to think about, that is the ceiling effect. So this leads to our next topic about ceiling effect, and Douglas will take us there. I'm going to give him the remote control. There we go, Doug.
Great, thanks, Yanni. Yeah, so the ceiling effect is a really interesting topic, but I didn't know much about it until I began my research. So before we get started, let's do a quick little pulse check here. How many of you have heard of the term ceiling effect? And how many of you know what it means? You could just write yes or no in the chat box. Okay, I'm seeing a consistent number of no responses. I think that's perfectly normal. So yeah, moving forward, we'll define the term ceiling effects and describe the problems that it can create before reviewing some evidence-based tactics on how to manage ceiling effects in your next survey. So what is the ceiling effect? In survey design, a ceiling effect occurs when you have scores that start to, or ratings that begin to cluster towards the top end of a scale, which prohibits you from making meaningful interpretations of that data. So for example, what if let's say that you decide to conduct a survey before and after some on-the-job coaching, hoping that you would see some improvement in trainee confidence levels over time. And in this survey, you happen to use a 3-point scale as shown on the screen, with possible response options ranging from not confident at all to somewhat confident to confident enough. And then what if after collecting that data, you saw very little differences in confidence levels before and after as shown in this graph? Would you be disappointed and maybe think that the coaching didn't have any impact? Well, yes, it's definitely possible that the coaching didn't add any value, and that's why you didn't see any difference in the results. But there's also another possibility, that your data suffered from what's known as a ceiling effect, perhaps because you only had the 3 response options to choose from. In fact, research has shown that using 3-point scales are highly prone to ceiling effects. What you see in the slide is from one of the research articles that we've reviewed. Their survey was about measuring patients' self-care practices, and the researchers used a 3-point scale and then a more granular 5-point scale. What they found from the survey was that when using the 3-point version, 39.4% of patients expressed no problems performing self-care. However, when they used the 5-point version, only 36.4% of participants described no problems in performing self-care. This means that the 5-point version helped to contribute to a relative 7.5% reduction in the ceiling effect. So it looks like increasing the number of response options from 3 to 5 can be helpful in reducing the ceiling effects. But can scales with even more response options, such as 7 or 10 points, provide even further benefits? Our research findings indicated both yes and no. In Dawes' research, they used 5, 7, and 10-point scales in their questionnaire, conducted over the phone, with response options being verbally described. The statement that you can see in the slide is from one of the survey items used. In the survey, 1 was always corresponded to strongly disagree, and then points 5, 7, or 10 always corresponded to strongly agree. The researchers found no meaningful differences in responses using the 5 versus the 7-point scale formats, but the 10-point version did slightly reduce the average score by 0.3 of a point. So that change may seem trivial to practitioners, but it was considered to be statistically significant to researchers, and it does represent one possible method that can be used to combat ceiling effects. Now, on the other hand, in Keeley's research, college students were assigned to watch a video of teachers exhibiting either good teaching behaviors or bad teaching behaviors. And then the students were asked to fill out questionnaires evaluating teacher performance using either a 5, 7, or a 9-point scale. In this study, researchers did not find that expanding the total number of response options significantly increased response variability or in any way helped to reduce ceiling effects. So if continuing to add additional scale points isn't always a practical or useful strategy, what else can we do? Another tactic is to add more options to the positive side of the response scale, known as positively packed unbalanced scales. So in the top option, we see a balanced 5-point Likert scale, which is commonly used because it offers an equal number of positive and negative response options, reducing the possibility of bias towards either end of the scale. However, there are times where you may already know that your survey participants have favorable attitudes towards the subject that you're researching. And in those instances, you may want to measure the positive attitudes or perceptions on a finer scale. In those instances, you can use an unbalanced scale that offers 3 positive options instead of the 2, and then 1 negative option as shown in the lower example. A team of researchers tested this idea by surveying people who attended an academic conference. Participants were divided into 2 groups and asked to rate the quality of individual breakout sessions they'd attended using one of the 2 response scales. One of the groups used this 5-point balanced Likert scale with the 2 positive and 2 negative options. And then the other group used an unbalanced scale that had 1 negative response option, but 3 positive ratings. The 2 groups' results are shown in the 2 bar graphs. The graph on the left is when they used the balanced scale version. Their data is less skewed and almost, or as you can see, the data is skewed and the data leans very much towards the positive response options. Now the bar graph on the right side is when they use the unbalanced scale. Their data is far less skewed and it's almost bell curve shaped. This research example demonstrates that some change to your response scales can and will generate different data distributions. Now, a final design option is to consider whether to label every single response point or just the endpoints. Survey designers may like fully labeled scales because it allows them to communicate very specific information on how to interpret each scale point. Partially labeled scales allow respondents to interpret the unlabeled scale points with their own meaning. So which method is more useful in reducing ceiling effects? A team of researchers studied this issue by comparing a partially labeled 10-point scale and a fully labeled 5-point scale. The research team mailed recently released hospital patients a satisfaction survey regarding the quality of care that they'd received during a recent stay. Half of the group were sent the 10-point version with only the endpoints labeled, and the other half were sent the 5-point fully labeled scale version. The researchers observed less ceiling effects in the data that was collected from the 5-point scale compared to what they saw with the partially labeled 10-point scale. And as you can see on the graph, the ceiling effects of the 5-point scale were about 15% lower than what you see in the partially labeled 10-point scale. However, there is one practical consideration towards fully labeling these scales. As you begin to increase the number of response options, it becomes increasingly difficult to find meaningful anchors to apply. So for example, in this example on the slide, you can see the anchors of moderately satisfied and quite satisfied. Personally, I don't find a lot of difference in the meaning between those 2 points. And it's very possible that such ambiguous language could be just as harmful as letting participants create their own meaning of each scale point. Okay, so that's our presentation addressing these 3 topics. And now I'll pass it back to you, Yanni.
All right, thank you. And to the audience, thank you. I mean, sorry about some of the text being screwed up a little bit. It was during the conversion between the files. But so let's recap quickly what we just talked about today. So be aware of the various response skills that you can use. There are lots of other things that you can choose from. And design the survey items by working backwards from ends in mind. So for instance, what type of data do you need really? How are you going to use the data to analyze the data? And then how are you going to present the data to your audience, the stakeholders? And then use some sort of a conversational tone to pair a survey statement or question and its response scale, so it sounds natural. And apply some sort of theoretical frameworks when designing survey items like ARCS model or BEM. And use repeated measures like a pre, post, and follow post-test or 360-degree surveys, and then use the same or similar survey item if you intend to compare the repeated measured data. And use a retrospective pre and post-survey method when the pre-survey data is not available. And use the same response scale for multiple survey items when needing to show an average score, like a summary evaluation. And then I talk about construct as the term that you need to measure. And use more specific descriptive response scale for individual survey items when needing to develop specific strategies for the conditions, like a formal evaluation or needs assessment. And pay attention to the cognitive overload and survey fatigue when designing too detailed descriptive scales, especially if you intend to use a lot of survey items in your questionnaires. If it's only 3, 4, 5 questions, that might not be a problem per se. And then lastly, to reduce the ceiling effects, if you need to reduce ceiling effects, then avoid response scales. There are only 3 or less options, and use positively packed, unbalanced response scales and fully labeled response scales to combat that. So, and we will, I think, Jennifer, you might be able to copy and paste the references for that. And if you would like to learn a little more about this evidence-based survey design principles, and those are the resources available for you, and we will share other information if we can. And if we have only a couple of minutes for comments or questions, but if anyone wants to just unmute yourself and ask your questions or make some comments or share your stories of designing survey, feel free to do so. It's for always on you.
Yeah, Yanni, we had a couple questions throughout, and I kind of wanted to wait to the end to address some of these because they were bigger questions than just like one answer. So one that came through kind of earlier in the presentation came from Andrea, and hold on just a second. Let me get it for it. Okay, so I'm sorry, it was Linza's question. The question was, in general, how involved are instructional designers in the needs assessment process, evaluation, and what job roles usually take the lead on these processes? That may be a big question to answer here. And then we have another one from Roger as well.
You know what? I would like to ask some of the audience to answer that question, because I know by the name, I can see some of the people who have an extensive experience about that, instruction design or needs assessment. Does anyone want to take up on this question?
Yanni, this is Catherine. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. As somebody that's worked as an ID for a long time and tried to keep my toe in the door on being performance improvement forward and not just someone that writes stuff. As far as doing needs assessment, evaluation, front-end analysis, it's going to vary depending on the company that you work for, the specific role that they hired you for, and basically, I guess, the maturity and culture of the company as far as where they're at, as far as really truly understanding what it is that performance improvement looks like. I can tell you that the companies I've worked for in the past, they did very little of needs assessment or evaluation. They felt like it just took too long, when really that's the proper process so that you know that you're doing what you need to do. So it really varies. I can tell you from ISPI conferences that I've been to that there are companies out there that people work for where they had their own organizational development group that actually did the analysis up front and on the back end that really helped the companies out. So I guess my bottom line winded statement is it really depends.
Mm-hmm. And at Boise State University, we offer those courses, and then we believe in the analysis, the importance of analysis. So it's analysis like all embedded in every single steps of performance improvement and even training design steps. So we really emphasize the analysis part in every step of the AD procedure. Well, we don't have too much time, but I am willing to stay longer if you have more questions. Christine, you can stop recording if you need to, but I don't know, it's up to you.
If you do have time to answer Roger's question real quick, he brought up a really good one, which would be a whole topic for another webinar, research article, whatever, but he asked, how do you take culture into consideration when developing a survey?
Oh yeah, that is a huge one.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, even survey may not be the right one to begin with. I mean, I did some pro bono consulting with the organization where the audience and then the stakeholders are not really good fit for the survey. They rather do interviews. So what I ended up doing was the more group interviews. It was a survey to begin with, but I thought, okay, interview is better. And then not individual interviews, but group interviews, so they can talk about things together. And then the focus group kind of interview was a better choice. So yeah, culture is definitely something that we have to consider when choosing the appropriate data collection methods. And if so, and if survey is chosen, then also what kind of survey reaction they usually have. I mean, are they really tired of survey? Okay, definitely consider shorter one, quicker one, not so long, very, specific responses.
Perfect. If there are no other questions, I really wanted to thank everyone for your time. I know that I wrote down a lot of questions and comments and from the presentation. I hope that you all also had an amazing time here. Thank you to our 3 guest presenters today. This will be recorded as well as saved and emailed to you for future use, so you can use it as a resource. Thank you all so much for your time. You have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thank you.